I'm going to start out with Paul Krugman, and afterwards, you know, I hope, that Christopher Hitchens has canceled, but we have a fabulous first act actually. James Reston Jr. will show us the Frost-Nixon interview tapes, the actual tapes, and then later in the day, you can hear him talk about his award-winning book, Nixon. Okay, please turn off your telephones, beepers, iPhones, whatever you have that makes noise. Know that this is being taped for C-SPAN 2. I hope you told your family you might be on. And you will be able to pull it up on iTunes U, as soon as we can get them all loaded, under Miami-Dade College. You have to join iTunes U, which is go to the iTunes site and load that on your computer, Mac or PC, it does not matter. And then you go to Miami-Dade College and it will be book fair. I was told we may be on the first page now, but we will be at the top then. And then you can enjoy all of the programs we videoed throughout the book fair, and you can see them in the middle of the night and early in the morning, whenever you want. Show your friends, tell them what they missed. Hope they'll be here next year for our 25th anniversary. It is my pleasure to get the morning started by introducing Charles Chapman. He is a friend of Miami Book Fair. You've seen him for years, and it was our delight to ask him to introduce Paul Krugman.
Thank you, Barbara. Paul Krugman has enjoyed a remarkable career as an economist and newspaper columnist. As a young man, he won the John Bates Clark Medal, which is awarded to outstanding economists under the age of 40. He also, believe it or not, served in the Reagan White House as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. He gained national prominence in 2001 when he began writing op-ed columns twice a week for the New York Times. Focusing on political economics, he aimed a gimlet eye at the Bush administration's tax cuts and later attempt to reform Social Security. He consistently exposed false and misleading explanations offered by the White House that had been accepted by others in an all-too-accommodating news media. More recently, he has expanded his purview to the entire political scene. Mr. Krugman inveighs against the conservative establishment and lays out a liberal vision for the country in his book, The Conscience of a Liberal. He also teaches economics and international affairs at Princeton University. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Krugman.
My apologies about the high tech here, but I wanted to read you some quotes, and the easiest way to do it. Also, I better explain about that Council of Economic Advisors thing. I was on the staff, not a member, and there was a group of technocrats who were brought in at that point, and I was the senior international economist. The senior domestic economist was a guy named, what's his name, Summers, Larry Summers. Don't know what happened to him. So anyway, it was an interesting time. Actually, it did partially, I think at some level it informed Conscience of a Liberal, because I did get to see that administration close up. Okay, first, why Conscience of a Liberal? Obviously, I'm echoing the title of Barry Goldwater's book. There are some differences, among them the fact that I actually wrote mine. But the Goldwater book, although I obviously disagree with where it was going, it did mark the beginning of a big turn in American politics. And the belief and hope of Conscience of a Liberal is that we're at another great turn, that we're ready for a big shift in direction, for reversing what I obviously regard as the very bad direction we've been going for several decades in this country. before I get to that, the book is largely about, before it gets to prescription and where we can go, a lot of it is about how we got here. And so a lot of it is history. It goes all the way back to the Gilded Age. It's largely about two themes, and I want to talk about those two themes for a while here. So one of the themes is the fall and rise of inequality in America, which is a process really you need to go back 70 years to get the whole story. The creation of a middle-class society and the return to a highly unequal society. So let me just tell you first something not many people know, which is that the middle-class society of the post-war years, I'm a baby boomer, the society I grew up in, did not evolve gradually out of the Gilded Age, out of the highly unequal society of the late 19th century. It's not the case that gradually America evolved a strong middle class. It happened very suddenly. It happened really between the late 1930s and the mid-1940s. And the economic historians call it the Great Compression. Income differences were compressed together, and it happened politically. It was, in fact, the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration, that created Social Security, unemployment insurance, minimum wage, highly progressive taxation, pro-union, or at least labor laws that safeguarded the right of workers to organize. And then during World War II, the way that wage and price controls were administered had the effect of equalizing incomes, but remarkably, that change in the narrowing of inequality that took place during the war lasted. Turns out that our notion that impersonal market forces determine what wages are is exaggerated, that if you establish a set of new norms about how people ought to be paid, it can last for a very long time. That lasted, as I said, for about 30 years after World War II, a little bit more. But then, beginning in the late 1970s, we started to pull apart. And at this point, when people talk about a second Gilded Age, it is not, that's not hyperbole, that's not a metaphor. By the numbers, the inequality of income today is as great as it was in the 1920s, just about exactly the same as it was in the 1920s. So we have gone fully back to the kinds of inequality we had before the Great Compression. Now, how did that happen? One of the arguments I make in the book is that to a much greater extent than people imagine, it is a question not of the invisible hand of the marketplace, not of technology and globalization, but of changes in institutions which are ultimately, in turn, driven by politics. Now, I can't, in this format, do the whole thing, but I can tell you, let me just give you a sample. So one of the things that clearly has changed in America is the near collapse of the union movement. In the 1960s, we had about 30% of workers in unions. It's now 12%. And in the private sector, it's under 8%. So we had this great reduction in unions, and there's a lot of reasons, a lot of evidence that a strong union movement, while there are a lot of things you can say about it, one effect it does have definitely is equalizing, both through the direct effect on union wages and through the effects that a strong union movement has on norms throughout the society. And of course, everybody knows that the reason that unions have declined so much is, well, it's just a changing economy, technology, globalization. Except that the collapse of the union movement is unique to the United States. Other advanced countries haven't seen anything like it. So that if we look at Canada, which is pretty faces the same globalization, the same technology, it's rather close to the United States, and even almost speaks the same language. In Canada, 30% of workers are still unionized. So what happened? And if you look at the timing, it turns out the collapse of the union movement in the United States mostly happened during the 1980s. There was not a clear decline until Ronald Reagan came to office. And then what happened? Well, it's a combination of things. There were symbolic things like the firing of the air traffic controllers and a general change towards essentially non-enforcement of the labor laws and the widespread illegal firing of workers who voted for unions. And if you want to think about the difference that makes, why is Walmart not unionized? It's not that it's inherently unsuitable. On the contrary, it's a giant firm, doesn't face international competition. Why shouldn't it have a union? Well, basically, Walmart got big in a period when the political environment was entirely favorable to union-busting efforts. And that's why America's largest employer has no union. Where does this political environment come from? And that's the second big story, the fall and rise of political polarization. So we have, I talk about in the book a lot about movement conservatism, which is not my term. It's actually the term that the movement conservatives themselves use. There is, yes, Virginia, there is a vast right-wing conspiracy, except it's not hidden. There's a clearly overlapping, interlocking set of institutions with a common purpose, ranging all the way from the Heritage Foundation to Fox News. Has clearly defined common goals, interchange of personnel, common funding sources. It's really extraordinary how many of these institutions, when you look in particular at the seed money, at who gave them money to get going, you find over and over again Richard Mellon Scaife, Koch, Olin, Coors, Smith Richardson, Bradley, the same set of foundations, same set of essentially wealthy families behind it all. I've always thought that I gather George Soros is talking this afternoon. The conspiracy theories. George Soros is behind everything. He's behind even global warming. That's all a myth created by the Soros conspiracy. I've always thought that there are various reasons why this is such a popular myth on the right, but one of them I think is that the idea that an evil billionaire is coordinating everything behind the scenes makes sense to them because that is the way things work in their world. What are the goals of movement conservatism? What they are principally, at core, they're different. I'll talk in a moment about why people vote for it, but the reason, if you look at the institutions themselves, what they're fundamentally about is economics. And in particular, rolling back the forces that produced the Great Compression. So that a fundraising letter from the Heritage Foundation, which reminds people to connect the dots, it says. Today's policies are a product of the Great Society of the 1960s, which grew out of the New Deal of the 1930s, which was an assault on founding principles. So, New Deal, Great Society, Social Security, Medicare, all of that is bad. We need to get rid of it. And my favorite, I'm sorry, there's a small dog living in my throat here. You'll hear him yapping now and then. Grover Norquist, Americans for Tax Action, who has been quite a significant figure in the movement, centerpiece of the K Street project to corral the lobbyists into being Republican supporters. But also, somebody said, I have to track this down, that he's like a James Bond villain who likes to explain his evil plans to you in detail. So we like to quote Grover Norquist. The quote everybody knows is the one about wanting to shrink the government to the size where you can drown it in the bathtub. But the one I like is he was asked, where does he want us to go? And he said he wanted us to get back to the way it was before Teddy Roosevelt, when the socialists took over. The income tax, the death tax, regulation, all that. So it's essentially roll back all of the liberal equalizing institutions of the 20th century. Okay, that has never been an election-winning platform. Most people, really like Social Security and Medicare. When asked about it, they generally don't think that rich people are paying enough taxes and so on. It's not always effective to run on those issues, but it's certainly, people don't support that program. So how has this conservative movement actually won so many elections? Well, the answer is by running other stuff. So there's a chapter in Conscience of a Liberal titled Weapons of Mass Distraction. Couldn't help myself. These things include, obviously, particularly in recent years, national security, cultural issues. And in one way, what happened in 2004 was almost perfect as an illustration of both what the movement is about and about how it has achieved political success. 2004 was a mainly national security and partially cultural election, or as I like to say, Bush ran as the defender of the nation against gay married terrorists. Then as soon as the election was over, he said, and our first priority is the privatization of Social Security. So it was this, remarkable, and a lot of his people who voted for him were basically, what? That wasn't what we thought we were voting for. However, in a different sense, 2004 was unusual because national security and cultural things have, on the whole, I did a lot of work here on reading the political science research, have been much less significant in driving elections for the most part than people think. 2002, 2004 were national security elections, but that was unusual. Mainly, what it's been about, and this is something I didn't expect I was going to come to when writing the book, and it's something that a lot of people find unacceptable, but it was about race. It's just overwhelming. Let's tell you what's overwhelming in the numbers. Once you look at the fact that Southern whites switched parties after the Civil Rights Movement, there's very little else left to explain. So, for example, there have been endless explanations of why white men have stopped voting Democratic. We know it's about moral values, it's about guns, it's about abortion, it's about Democrats are weak on national security, the Democrats are the mommy party, all of these things to explain why white men have turned away from the Democrats. Except it never happened, once you take the Southern switch into account. In 1952, 40% of non-Southern white males voted Democratic. In 2004, 39% of non-Southern white males voted Democratic. There is nothing to explain once you take into account the fact that Southern whites started voting Republican. All of these other things are just not a major factor in the elections. Now, as a question, was this a deliberate strategy? Well, we know that Richard Nixon said, let's pursue the Southern strategy, that was deliberate on his part. Ronald Reagan. There's nothing, Ronald Reagan has been elevated to saintly status. People get very upset when you suggest that maybe he was a bit of a cynical political operator. And so there's hysterical reaction to the suggestion that when Ronald Reagan opened his 1980 campaign, not with a speech on tax cuts, not with a speech on national security, but by going to Philadelphia, Mississippi, where the 3 civil rights workers had been murdered in 1964, and saying, I believe in local control of education, I believe in states' rights. People say, oh, yes, he shouldn't have said that, but he really didn't mean anything by it. It was just, it was not a shout out to Southern whites, it was just an innocent mistake. And you have to say, look, that does fit in character, because Reagan did have a tendency to make innocent mistakes. When he went on and on about the welfare queen driving her Cadillac, and kept telling the story years after it had in fact been debunked. It never happened. A lot of people thought that was a shout out to implicit racist rhetoric, but it was just an innocent mistake. When he gave speeches about how annoyed people must be when they're buying groceries, and ahead of them in line is some strapping young buck buying T-bone steaks. Oddly, he gave that speech about the groceries and the food stamps in a lot of places, but he only used the word strapping young buck when he was talking to Southern audiences. But he didn't actually mean that to be a call out to racism. It was just an innocent mistake. When he said that in 1980, that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had been humiliating to the South, and that he didn't mean to be saying that he thought that blacks should have been continued to be excluded from the polls. It was just an innocent mistake. When he intervened on behalf of Bob Jones University, which was trying to keep its tax-exempt status, he really didn't know that the reason it was losing it was because it banned interracial dating, and he certainly didn't mean to give any signals there. It was just an innocent mistake. And when he opposed the making Martin Luther King Day a national holiday, conceding only after the law creating the holiday was passed by huge veto-proof bipartisan majorities. I mean, he really wasn't meaning to send any signal. It was just an innocent mistake. Okay, well, you get the picture. It's pretty clear that this was a deliberate strategy. And as I say, the race-based shift in American voting leaves, I say in Conscience of a Liberal, there's almost nothing left to explain. All the other things that you give about why the New Deal coalition lost control of the country and why the conservative movement was so successful, all of those explanations are actually trying to explain something that isn't there, which is the residual shift to the Republicans, other than that, that's clearly related to the backlash against the civil rights movement. So, this is a happy book. And it's a happy book because I believe that this period in American history is over or very nearly over. And I can talk about open water bottle. Someone's planning to poison me, I think. Probably the Department of Homeland Security, which I'll tell you what I really, really want as one of the first acts of the next president is to change the name of that department. We should not. It does really sound like a literal translation of Heimatsicherheitsableitung, doesn't it? Anyway, okay. All right. So how do I give you a really quick explanation of why I think everything is changing? Now, partly, there really is a shift in public opinion broadly. If you look at a variety of polls, they show that, if you like, economic populism has made a comeback. If you look at various kinds of attempts to aggregate data on people's views on economic issues, the public is more liberal now than it has been since the early 1960s. There's a recent, it's not in the book because it's more recent than that, there's just a recent poll by Democracy Corps. They look at, their starting point is a huge fraction of the country, of the public believes that the country is heading in the wrong direction. And then they ask people who said that the country is heading in the wrong direction to choose from a variety of phrases to what they care about most. And I would have thought that Iraq would be at the top, but actually the top two were big businesses get whatever they want in Washington, and leaders have forgotten the middle class. So I think there is a real swing in people. People have noticed the extraordinary increase in inequality that's taken place in this country, and they're not happy about it. But what about the ability to wield those weapons of mass distraction? And I really have a pretty simple answer to that, which is macaca. I thought that moment, the defeat of George Allen was in the Virginia Senate race was extraordinary, not because George Allen, by the way, you have to really have read some of the articles, in National Review a few months before the incident about George Allen to get a sense. He was viewed as, the second coming of Ronald Reagan. He was viewed as the man who was going to, a future Republican presidential nominee, almost for sure. And then he was being trailed on the campaign, as all candidates are now, by somebody from the other side with a video cam. And in this case, a young American man of South Asian descent. And he used what turned out to be an obscure racial insult repeatedly against the guy. Well, that's not new. I mean, racial insults are certainly nothing new in American politics. What's new is that the public wouldn't stand for it, that the voters of Virginia wouldn't stand for it. And there's a whole array of reasons reasons why race, which has been, again, central to the American political story, is just losing its effectiveness. Part of it is just the raw demography. We are becoming a more diverse, or to be a little bit blunter, a less white country. The growing role of Latinos and to a lesser extent, of Asians is shifting the demographic mix. These are groups that, are they non-white? Well, the Republican base sees them as non-white, which is what matters. And they respond by actually voting heavily against the Republican Party as it now stands. In a way, that's why the fact that S.J. Sidharth was, a.k.a. Macaca, was there, was also partly revealing. It was, in fact, a child of immigrants that was the subject of the insults. The other, which is more uplifting, is that we really are a less racist country. Not entirely, obviously, by a long shot, but much more so. So you look at some of the in Conscience of a Liberal, I find it revealing to look at polls not on direct political issues, but on more sort of emotional issues that really get at some sense of how people feel. So in 1978, just on the verge of the great triumph of movement conservatism, a solid majority of Americans did not think that interracial marriage was acceptable. Right? I don't know what that was about, but anyways, the solid majority of Americans in the late 1970s opposed interracial marriage. Today, 77% say it's perfectly okay. We just have changed. We're not that country anymore, which means that the prime issue that the right has used to win elections is no longer really available to them, and in fact can turn into a liability, as it did for George Allen. So I think that the time is ripe for a huge change in direction, for a progressive movement, if you like, to undo the damage from the conservative movement. Where does it start? And the answer, of course, is healthcare. Healthcare is so, first of all, just in itself, it's something where the need for reform, the growing sense of crisis is overwhelming. And the U.S. healthcare system has, well, the U.S. healthcare system is one of the wonders of the world, I guess you might say. It manages to be both monstrously unjust and monstrously inefficient. We're the only advanced country in which citizens can be denied essential health care because they can't afford it. We're the only advanced country in which citizens can be financially ruined by the costs of essential health care. And yet, we spend far, far more on health care per person than any other country, without better results, and in many cases with worse results. Our life expectancy is still, I believe, slightly higher than that of Costa Rica. But we really do very, very badly on the metrics. We achieve no better health care, maybe worse, at enormous expense, and we know how to fix it. There are, ideally, I'd be for a Medicare-type system for everyone. There are reasons why politically that's difficult to move to, at least as a first step. We have pretty good compromises coming, pretty good hybrid systems with prospects for improvement coming out now from the Democratic presidential candidates. I have to say, sometimes I have to pinch myself because not much more than 2.5 years ago, it really seemed possible that Bush was going to gut Social Security, the centerpiece of the New Deal. Now it looks like we have a reasonable possibility of actually having legislation establishing a universal health care system by 2010. So it's really amazing. None of this is guaranteed. I spent a lot of time, you might say, wallowing in the history of the New Deal, because Franklin Delano Roosevelt is my hero on these things. And he clearly had an opportunity. The Great Depression had discredited the right-wing orthodoxy of his time. He was able to say, there's this great speech at Madison Square Garden before the '36 election, where he was able to say that we have always known that the heedless pursuit of self-interest was bad morals. We now know that it is bad economics too. But you look and you realize it might not have happened if it had been someone else. Some of the other candidates who might have gotten that Democratic nomination in '32 were pretty much orthodox, would not have done the things he did. I do hearken back a little bit to the Gilded Age, when there were populist Democrats, but they were so underfunded when they ran, they never got anywhere near the White House. The only Democrat who did win was Grover Cleveland, who was what they called at the time a Bourbon Democrat, as in the French royal family. So it they were, not so different from the Republicans. And that is the real question, I think, right now. The odds are that it will be a Democrat in the White House next year. That we will have, that there will be a Democratic majority in Congress, and the Democratic majority in the House is actually the most progressive Democratic majority ever in terms of its positioning. But we don't know if they'll actually deliver. The question I asked in the Times a few weeks back was, we hope that we're about to elect another FDR. We're afraid that we might be about to elect another Grover Cleveland. And that's, and I have friends who think that Hillary Clinton looks a lot like Grover Cleveland, but I'd have to say the policies she's espousing right now are in fact very, very progressive. So hopeful but anxious. I'll just close by saying, the change since, I think I was at this book fair 4 years ago with The Great Unraveling, and that was a book written at a time when things seemed incredibly dark. For me, I think for a lot of people, it felt like a nightmare. One of those nightmares where you're screaming and no one can hear you. which is particularly odd when you're doing your screaming on the op-ed page of the New York Times. It is so much better now. The atmosphere is so much better that I'm feeling, incredibly hopeful and optimistic. Some of my friends say I'm sounding so optimistic they're worried that they want to know whether I'm actually okay. But I think the prospects for change are better than they have been for a very, very long time. So I'm hopeful, and I'm hopeful that this book will be marked like Conscience of a Conservative was as the beginning of a great change, but this time for the better in American life. Thank you.
I was going to say the questioners should line up behind the microphone, but there are half a dozen there already, so I suspect Mr. Krugman will need to answer. However, he also needs a drink of water, so while you continue to queue up, okay, we're ready for the first question.
Okay. AARP, which totally capitulated on Medicare Part D a few years ago, is promoting a campaign called Divided We Fail. The idea is that we seniors should urge our legislators, Republicans and Democrats, to work together on our behalf. This button, which depicts half an elephant and half a donkey, is what they're giving out. I consider it half-assed. I'm also wearing it upside down as a sign of, the universal sign of distress. Would you care to comment on the idea of Republicans working together with Democrats on anything?
Okay, in fact, there's in the last chapter of Conscience of a Liberal, I talk about partisanship and why sometimes it's a good thing. There are times when, there's a beltway illusion. Pundits inside the beltway think that the American center is, somewhere between Joe Lieberman and John McCain. And this is not true, right? If you look at American public opinion, it is strongly progressive. It is not at all. If anything, it's a little bit to the left of the center of the Democratic Party. And the idea that we're going to get compromise, again, FDR, that same speech, Madison Square Garden speech, he talked about the hatred he engendered among the forces of opposed to him, and he said, "I welcome their hatred." He was a staunch partisan. The great era of bipartisanship in American life began after the 1948 election, when Harry Truman, everybody knows, give them hell, Harry, but who was he giving hell, and what was he giving them hell about? He was giving the Republicans hell for wanting to roll back the New Deal. And after the Republican Party realized for a while that they could not do that, Dwight Eisenhower wrote a letter to his brother about people who thought they could do away with Social Security, and he said their number is negligible and they are stupid. Only after basically the decision of Republicans to accept these institutions was there an era of bipartisanship. And that's what has to happen this time. There has to be, universal health care is not going to have Republican support. It's going to be passed. If it happens at all, it's going to be passed over kicking and screaming. Think about the fact that the Bush administration is violently opposed to expanding health care for children, let alone to the country as a whole. Once it's in place, and maybe after the people who opposed it have lost a couple of national elections very badly, then we can possibly get to a new era of bipartisanship. You can see this now in California, where Arnold Schwarzenegger, I think Schwarzenegger is actually the future of the Republican Party in style, although he won't ever be president except on The Simpsons. But after he was rocked back by the California voters on his propositions, then he decided he really had to govern as a centrist from a California point of view, which is actually quite liberal. That's where it'll go. But first, the idea that we're going to get the party of Grover Norquist and Tom DeLay to work together with others on solving our problems of health care is just not going to happen.
I'm totally surprised at your answer.
My question involves the difficulty of possibly admitting you're wrong in a politically contentious environment. I think of a column you wrote a couple of years ago on Iraq, likening the administration's position to playing a poker game. They were losing the hand, and rather than cut their losses, I think that's what you said, they wanted to keep playing because you don't want to admit you're wrong. I'm a skeptic on Iraq. I look at the surge. Violence is down. I don't think it's working. Maybe in a year it will allow the dysfunctional government to work. It's one thing for me to have those thoughts. Somebody as public as you, if you voice doubts, that would be vilified. How do you deal with that?
Oh, I mean, I like to hope that I'm willing to admit mistakes when I make them, and I have, but not about that, I think. If we look at Iraq, it's, I don't know the Latin, but they have made a desert and they called it peace. Violence is down in Baghdad basically because sectarian cleansing is nearly complete. Violence is down in Anbar province because not because we defeated the insurgents, but basically because they won and we decided to accept them and they got rid of the troublesome outsiders. But effectively, the people that we are now working with in Anbar are the insurgents. Violence is somewhat down in southern Iraq, basically because we've reached an accommodation with the Shiite militias. So no, it's not. And the public, you know, this war is still costing nearly $10 billion a month. So you may say, well, you know, the number of Americans killed per month is down to the levels of 2005. But you know, we didn't think it was actually going well in 2005. So no, this is not the success story. In the end, you know, we may get a somewhat stable Shiite theocracy in Iraq. Was that what we were prepared to spend $2 trillion for?
I think I'm as skeptical as you. I think I meant the question in a more general sense.
Oh, people don't. I try to admit mistakes when I make them. I'd like to hope that we'll see more of that. The most disturbing thing I might say about Rudy Giuliani, and of course there are many disturbing things, is that he shows sign of being even less able to admit error than the current occupant of the White House.
I want to get back into your point of economics that you opened up with.
I really am sorry about this. This is what book tour does to you. Thank you.
Two aspects of the economic situation. One which is rarely talked about, except in a partisan way, but nothing is done about it, and that is the impact of the women at entering into the economic society, if you will, the breaking or at least the cracking of the glass ceiling. I think that business has taken advantage of women trying to get into the society by still keeping a tremendous disparity in the income, and at the same time creating the same income.
Is there a question?
No, excuse me. At the same income, I wanted to comment on the creating a same income for the family that existed before the entry of the women.
All right. Yeah. No, I think I can look. There has been a transformation with increased participation of women in the workforce. They still earn less than men, even with everything taken equivalent. Although that is somewhat diminished. It's not a major factor in explaining the inequality. You can just I could go through that chapter and verse, but it's not. It is true that if you look at median family income, it's up entirely. It's not up very much, and it's up to the extent that it's up entirely because of an increased number of working wives. So, you know, prime age working males are actually making less than they did 35 years ago. But this is not. There are many. Put it this way. France. If you look at people of prime working years, 25 to 54, the fraction of French people who are employed is exactly the same as the fraction of American people who are employed. It's 80% in both countries. And in both countries, there's large-scale participation by women in the workforce. yet they don't have our increase in inequality. So it's not that. I think other people would like to ask a question. Please.
Sorry.
Hello, Professor Krugman.
I'm sorry, there are just a lot of people here, and we have very little time.
That's okay. My question is about the U.S. dollar, which affects everybody in this room. It's has lost value over the last 5 years, something like close to 35%, which means if you take $100 out of the bank, you can throw 35 of them away, and that's pretty much what's happened to your wallet. My question to you is, do you see this as a good or a bad thing for the U.S. economy? And what do you see as the most likely catalyst to turn this around in the future, if you think there is one?
Okay, yeah. Do I see the fall in the U.S. dollar as a good or a bad thing for the U.S. economy? And the answer, of course, is yes. Look, it does mean somewhat higher inflation, higher prices for imported goods. It means a lot higher prices if you're planning to go to Europe this summer, which I am. But actually, it's one of the saving graces of the economy right now. Housing is collapsing, subprime, we have everything domestic is in big trouble. And the one bright spot in the economy is rising exports. And the falling dollar is actually helping that. And I think it's largely unavoidable. The U.S. trade deficit has to come down. The only way that can happen is by making U.S. goods more attractive, both to domestic purchasers and to foreign purchasers. And that means a weaker dollar. I actually have a blog at the Times now, and I have a post I put up last night with the slightly alarming title to me, Robert Rubin is wrong about the dollar. Very hard to actually say Robert Rubin is wrong, but I did. And I don't think that the fall in the dollar is avoidable. It's just something that is actually required as part of the process of adjustment. The dollar was grossly overvalued on a PPE basis, which is proof of the pudding is in the eating. We're not selling enough stuff abroad, and that just requires a weaker dollar. Yeah.
Historians have come to compare the U.S. with the Roman Empire. We know that the Roman Empire sailed the Mediterranean for 1,000 years without being unchallenged. Yeah. Do you see any threat, global threat to the middle class through free trade, or is it an unfair comparison?
Yeah, I don't think comparisons between us and the Roman Empire are very accurate. I mean, the Romans actually, the Romans actually managed to win their wars of occupation. No, it's just very different. The United States doesn't depend on tribute for its prosperity. No, we're not that kind of society. And actually, conquest doesn't pay in the modern world. The most prosperous economies tend to be the ones that where the countries manage to mostly mind their own business. So no, I don't think there are a lot of things that scare me. I mean, beyond the immediate financial worries, I worry a lot about the environment. There is this question, in the end, I don't worry about China as a competitor. I do worry that the Chinese are going to poison us all by burning so much coal, both through carbon dioxide emissions and through all the mercury they're putting into the global atmosphere. But those are the things that worry me, not these sort of rise and fall of empire. We are not an empire, both in terms of motivations and in terms of competence. We just don't stack up against the Romans.
Thank you very much for your willingness to come out and visit and address this crowd this morning. I know everyone appreciates it.
Well, thank you.
You touched on the American dollar's decline to 76 cents at close on Friday. Can you speak a moment about housing administration, or the $1 trillion which is estimated to be either reset or foreclosed on, and the best estimates are there's $50 billion a year over the next 5 years. A falling dollar means less value of hard assets.
I'm sorry, are we talking about Iraq? Is that the...
No, we were talking about, you mentioned that we have a falling dollar.
Yeah.
And does that not mean that the hard assets held by Americans are going to decline because they were bought with that dollar.
No, because the dollar is falling in terms of other people's currencies. This affects Americans only to the extent that you're going to be buying something that is valued in someone else's currency, which means some imported goods. It means certainly if you're planning to travel abroad, but it doesn't. Most of what we buy is services produced here. It's just not an issue. And in fact, maybe I should give you the reassuring why we are not Argentina. The trouble, the places where a falling currency produces a terrible crisis are places that have a lot of foreign debt in someone else's currency. So when the currency devalues, the value of that foreign debt blows up in value. We don't have that problem. Our foreign debts are in dollars. The United States actually has a lot of foreign assets too, which are in euros or yen, or and those actually increase in value. So we're actually our balance sheets get better when the dollar falls. So it's not. There are a lot of things to worry about, but not that one. I know people get really upset, but really your ability to buy a house is not going to be affected by the falling dollar. Your ability to buy most things is not going to be affected. Your ability to buy a house in London is going to be affected, but you can't afford it anyway. Thanks.
My concern, this is a question I've asked other people, but my concern is as the President and Cheney have been working on a unitary executive, with the Military Commission and Executive Directive number 51, do we see any possible problems in the next election? Especially with the Iran thing elevating as an excuse for anything.
Well, Iran scares me. All serious analyses say that bombing would be a terrible, stupid mistake, which means it might well happen. If Bush had been more successful, I would worry a lot about what extra constitutional things he might do. I don't think many people would go along with something at this point. I mean, it's in a peculiar way, it's almost a saving grace of this administration that they've been so hapless at doing anything except waving the flag and scaring people that nobody really puts much trust in what they would do. So I'm not too worried, but it is true. I mean, I can't really answer your question, but it is true that for the most part, worst expectations have been fulfilled again and again these past 7 years. But I guess I believe that we will have a not entirely fair but not grossly distorted election next year. I hope I'm right. And if it's held that way, I don't believe that this gang will be in power anymore.
One final question, please. As the dollar continues to fall, does this not mean that the price of imported oil will increase, and will that not have a recessionary effect on the U.S. economy?
Yeah, quite. I mean, the price of oil is it is now back, inflation adjusted, to its levels right after the fall of the Shah in Iran. This is not good. We do burn less oil per dollar of GDP than we used to. It's not quite as exposed, but yeah, I mean, all right. My record at calling recessions is not good, although let me tell you there's a dirty little secret. Nobody's is. But the people who try to do this, I'm not even trying, but the people who are trying to do this are now giving us about 50-50 odds on a recession next year. And even if it isn't a recession, it can feel pretty lousy. I think we're guaranteed of a 2008 that feels really lousy. Weak employment growth. So sure, I mean, oil prices plus housing, and that one I did call, right? Plus the financial spillover from housing. This is, in economic terms, the Bush administration is going to go out with an eek. It's pretty bad. Whether it's, I don't think it's the end of the world, but it is certainly looking like a pretty grim next year. Trying to think of something hopeful. Well, these things do go away eventually, someday, maybe. Okay, thank you all. Unemployment insurance, minimum wage, highly progressive taxation, pro-union, or at least labor laws that safeguarded the right of workers to organize. And then during World War II, the way that wage and price controls were administered had the effect of equalizing incomes, but remarkably, that change in the narrowing of inequality that took place during the war lasted. Turns out that our notion that impersonal market forces determine what wages are is exaggerated, that if you establish a set of new norms about how people ought to be paid, it can last for a very long time. That lasted, as I said, for about 30 years after World War II, a little bit more. But then, beginning in the late 1970s, we started to pull apart. And at this point, when people talk about a second Gilded Age, it is not, that's not hyperbole, that's not a metaphor. By the numbers, the inequality of income today is as great as it was in the 1920s, just about exactly the same as it was in the 1920s. So we have gone fully back to the kinds of inequality we had before the Great Compression. Now, how did that happen? One of the arguments I make in the book is that to a much greater extent than people imagine, it is a question not of the invisible hand of the marketplace, not of technology and globalization, but of changes in institutions which are ultimately, in turn, driven by politics. Now, I can't, in this format, do the whole thing, but I can tell you, let me just give you a sample. We're ready for a big shift in direction, for reversing what I obviously regard as the very bad direction we've been going for several decades in this country. Before I get to that, the book is largely about, before it gets to prescription and where we can go, a lot of it is about how we got here. And so a lot of it is history. It goes all the way back to the Gilded Age. It's largely about two themes, and I want to talk about those two themes for a while here. So one of the themes is the fall and rise of inequality in America, which is a process, really, you need to go back 70 years to get the whole story. The creation of a middle-class society and the return to a highly unequal society. So let me just tell you first something not many people know, which is that the middle-class society of the post-war years, I'm a baby boomer, the society I grew up in, did not evolve gradually out of the Gilded Age, out of the highly unequal society of the late 19th century. It's not the case that gradually America evolved a strong middle class. It happened very suddenly. It happened really between the late 1930s and the mid-1940s. And the economic historians call it the Great Compression. Income differences were compressed together, and it happened politically. It was, in fact, the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration, that created Social Security.
It is my pleasure to get the morning started by introducing Charles Chapman. He is a friend of Miami Book Fair. You've seen him for years, and it was our delight to ask him to introduce Paul Krugman.
Thank you, Barbara. Paul Krugman has enjoyed a remarkable career as an economist and newspaper columnist. As a young man, he won the John Bates Clark Medal, which is awarded to outstanding economists under the age of 40. He also, believe it or not, served in the Reagan White House as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. He gained national prominence in 2001 when he began writing op-ed columns twice a week for the New York Times. Focusing on political economics, he aimed a gimlet eye at the Bush administration's tax cuts and later attempt to reform Social Security. He consistently exposed false and misleading explanations offered by the White House that had been accepted by others in an all-too-accommodating news media. More recently, he has expanded his purview to the entire political scene, Mr. Krugman inveighs against the conservative establishment.
I'm going to start out with Paul Krugman, and afterwards, you know, I hope, that Christopher Hitchens has canceled, but we have a fabulous first act, actually. James Reston Jr. will show us the Frost-Nixon interview tapes, the actual tapes, and then later in the day, you can hear him talk about his award-winning book, Nixon. Okay, please turn off your telephones, beepers, iPhones, whatever you have that makes noise. Know that this is being taped for C-SPAN 2. I hope you told your family you might be on. And you will be able to pull it up on iTunes U, as soon as we can get them all loaded, under Miami-Dade College. You have to join iTunes U, which is go to the iTunes site and load that on your computer, Mac or PC, it does not matter. And then you go to Miami-Dade College and it will be book fair. I was told we may be on the first page now, but we will be at the top then. And then you can enjoy all of the programs we videoed throughout the book fair, and you can see them in the middle of the night and early in the morning, whenever you want. Show your friends, tell them what they missed. Hope they'll be here next year for our 25th anniversary.
And lays out a liberal vision for the country in his book, The Conscience of a Liberal. He also teaches economics and international affairs at Princeton University. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Krugman.
My apologies about the high tech here, but I wanted to read you some quotes, and the easiest way to do it. Also, I better explain about that Council of Economic Advisors thing. I was on the staff, not a member, and there was a group of technocrats who were brought in at that point, and I was the senior international economist. The senior domestic economist was a guy named, what's his name, Summers, Larry Summers. Don't know what happened to him. So anyway, it was an interesting time. Actually, it did partially, I think at some level it informed Conscience of a Liberal, because I did get to see that administration close up. Okay, first, why Conscience of a Liberal? Obviously, I'm echoing the title of Barry Goldwater's book. There are some differences, among them the fact that I actually wrote mine. But the Goldwater book, although I obviously disagree with where it was going, it did mark the beginning of a big turn in American politics. And the belief and hope of Conscience of a Liberal is that we're at another great turn.